on this, the 10th annual same name, different game WrestleMania special. We are talking about the greatest arcade wrestling game of all time. That's right, same name, different game universe. For the 10th time in a row, Joey Pink is taking over SNDG because we are on the oddly barren road to WrestleMania, which, as of this recording, is scheduled to go on from the Performance Center over not 1, but 2 days for the first time in history. And in the spirit of this being the 10th annual WrestleMania special, I want you all to know that I was definitely, absolutely, for sure, going to shoot this at Madison Square Garden. But there's a pandemic going on, so I guess I have to do it from the house. And speaking of which, no matter how big of a heel you are, stay in your house and wash your hands. Anyways, because this is the 10th time I've done this, I'm doing something extra special for this WrestleMania special. For the first time in SNDG history, I'm checking out an arcade game that we're going to play on real arcade hardware. That's right, it's one of my all-time favorites, featuring some of my all-time favorites. So enough ring introductions, let's ring the bell and get underway with a little history. The name WWF WrestleFest comes from a now defunct series of live events and VHS tapes released in the 80s and 90s, the first of which emanated from my hometown of Milwaukee on July 31st, 1988, taking place at what was then the home of the Brewers, Milwaukee County Stadium. It features a steel cage main event between Andre the Giant and Hulk Hogan, as well as Randy Savage defending his WWF title against the $1 Million Man, Ted DiBiase, Jake the Snake versus Rick Rude, and much, much more. The WrestleFest tapes that followed were typically more akin to best of tapes, featuring a selection of matches, though apparently at least a couple were compiled from live events specifically meant to go directly to VHS without any TV airings. The name was shockingly kept alive into the early Attitude Era, with a couple of In Your House pay-per-views getting released on VHS under the WrestleFest banner for some reason. But that ain't why you're here, same name, different game universe. You're here for the game. We talked a few years ago about WWF Superstars, the first WWF arcade game from Technos. And while the house that Kunio built didn't enter the licensed wrestling game world until that game, they had been hard at work on arcade graps games for years by that point, refining and honing their craft to a fine edge. You remember Tag Team Wrestling? The arcade original was them. Mat Mania? That was them. The follow-up, Mania Challenge? Them. And all three of those were successes for Technos before Kunio or Billy Lee ever set foot on a street full of gang members. With Superstars in 1989, they hit the big time, but the follow-up, WWF WrestleFest, released in arcades in 1991, would prove to be their magnum opus of the squared circle. And this, same name, different game maniacs, is our first game for this episode. And you're going to have to forgive me if I spend a lot of time just putting this one over, because it is a shoot to tell you it's one of my favorite arcade games of all time. A big part of this game's success likely had to do with timing. The arcade scene worldwide got a huge shot in the arm in February of 1991 when Capcom's generation-defining mega hit Street Fighter II was released in arcades. This happened alongside the rise of popular 4-player belt-scrolling beat-em-ups like Konami's Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, Turtles in Time, Data East's Captain America and the Avengers, and Capcom's Captain Commando, among others, all of which also released in 1991. And really, what is this game at its core but a belt scroller with WWF wrestlers? Which is probably why it's so good. Technos continually proved themselves masters of the genre they originated with Renegade. This is not only a stellar game in a brawler formula, but also the platonic ideal of a sequel, in that it improves on WWF Superstars in every way. Bigger roster, bigger sprites, more moves, more voice samples, more WWF shows represented, the big blue steel cage, the addition of 4-player support to Superstars 2, and a new mode. So let's go ahead and run down all those bigger, better, badder features, starting with the roster. While Superstars had a paltry 6 playable characters with Ted DiBiase and Andre the Giant as bosses, WrestleFest has 12 total characters, with 10 of the biggest stars of this era playable. Let's run them down. Returning from Superstars, we have Hulk Hogan, of course, as well as the Ultimate Warrior, the Big Boss Man, and Ted DiBiase, now playable. Sadly, due to his, retirement at WrestleMania 7, Randy Savage does not return, but in his place, we got 6 completely new playable grapplers. Mr. Perfect, Earthquake, Jake the Snake Roberts, Sergeant Slaughter, and both members of Demolition, Smash, and Crush, as this was during a time that Bill Eadie, Demolition Axe, was stepping away from the ring. And the non-playable bosses this time? Oh, what a rush! It's Road Warrior Hawk and Road Warrior Animal, the Legion of Doom. And it bears repeating, these wrestlers are all represented by bigger, more detailed sprites. Just look at them. In the classic Technos arcade art style, these guys look like they could walk right into a Double Dragon game. And they have so many unique animations. They got their own finishers too, from Hogan's leg drop to the perfect plex and everything in between. And while the commentary isn't from a voice I recognize, it's still really cool to hear play-by-play from all the way back in 1991. And speaking of play-by-play, I suppose we should talk about the gameplay here. Yeah, it's a bit of that button mashing to win grapples formula, but like Superstars before it, it's generally not as tough as a lot of similar games. Nothing like 3-count bout on Neo Geo to say the very least. If you initiate a grapple, especially if your opponent is dazed, you're very likely to win that grapple, though the Legion of Doom can be a little bit cheap. But I will say in the Saturday Night Main Event mode, your partner can go to power-up mode in which you win pretty much every grapple, giving you a good advantage. This game gives you a punch and kick button, which can be used with different directions on the joystick to perform various grapples. Your finisher tends to automatically come out once your opponent is weak enough, unless it's a move done to a downed opponent. If that's the case, you generally have to wait for the new knocked down but lying on an angle status, and then you can do moves like Earthquake. Hogan's leg drop, and the Ultimate Warrior's running splash, though I do have to say that this game's idea of the Cobra Clutch is different. You can also do some team-up moves, though only Hawk and Animal get a tag finisher. The Doomsday Device, of course. On top of that, you can go outside the ring like in Superstars and use a handful of weapons for big-time damage. Now let's talk presentation, because for the era, this game outshines every other on that front. The logos of both shows and the wrestlers are correct. At the beginning of each match, we're shown the wrestler logos along with ring introductions by real WWF ring announcer Mike McGurk, though I don't think that's actually her voice. There are two ring styles, each based on a show at the time: Superstars and Wrestling Challenge. There's even a cage match that happens automatically on the third match of each playthrough. The only thing it really changes is that Irish whips now slam your opponent into the cage, but it looks very cool and accurate to the cages of the time in WWF. And finally, the game adds a new mode. The standard tag match held over from Superstars is now known as Saturday Night's Main Event. But when you plunk in your quarter, you can either choose that or the Royal Rumble. And you know something, Mean Gene? In the Royal Rumble, it's every man for himself.
When 30 of the greatest superstars of the World Wrestling Federation congregate in a competition where it's every man for himself, no allies, only enemies.
That's right. And in this Royal Rumble, you've got up to 6 wrestlers on screen at once, which was pretty impressive by the standards of the day. Now, this match doesn't work exactly like a real Royal Rumble, of course. For starters, there's only 12 roster members, not 30. But less obviously, there's the option to pin opponents and not just throw them over the top. While tossing them out may be most efficient, getting close enough to the ropes to do it can put you at risk as well. Pinning in this mode also allows multiple wrestlers to dogpile on one and score a pinfall elimination. And if I can go back to presentation for just a moment, the little portraits of the new entrants into the match are so good. Check these out. Overall, this is one of my very favorite arcade games, to the point that when I took the plunge and started buying arcade boards, this was the very first one I picked up. If you're a fan of late 80s or early 90s WWF or arcade gaming, you owe it to yourself to check this one out. And I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, Radiant One, Joey Pink, back in the 90s, did this game get a port? And the answer is no. We would not see the resurgence of WrestleFest, if you can even call it that, until over 20 years later for the iPhone. And we're doing another first on this episode, folks. You see, SNDG Maniacs, this is the first time I'm talking about a game that I haven't played. Sad but true, SNDG universe, but this game was only released on iOS, and I've never owned an iPhone or iPad, and the game has since been delisted anyways. It was announced for the Xbox 360 and PS3, and of course Android, but the tepid response on iOS meant it never hit those systems. What you're seeing here is footage of the 360 version, compliments of Andrew Borman of the Strong Museum of Play, which might shock you since it looks like a mobile game. Well, that's because it is, in effect, a straight port of the mobile game. The other versions were quietly cancelled, though a former THQ community manager who worked on WWE stuff did tell us via Twitter that the game was only planned to go to other platforms if the iOS version did well, which it clearly didn't. This was also right before THQ went bankrupt, and I'm sure that's a factor. I'm sure it won't come as a surprise to you gaming history buffs out there if I say that no one involved with the original had a hand in this one. Technos went under in the mid-90s, but for some time expatriates associated with him worked at places like then IP Holder Million and Miracle Kids. But this game It was developed by Taipei mobile developer Seed Studio. The game, as I understand it, is largely the same from a gameplay perspective, but added a ton of new and classic superstars, along with a new look that I, frankly, hate. Like I said before, folks, this one looks like a mobile game, specifically one from the early 2010s, and that's a look that I have never liked. The animation is extremely choppy, particularly when compared to the original game. I mean, come on, folks. Some of these moves got about 3 frames of animation, and it was not received well. I'm not normally one who cares about critical consensus, but I don't have a lot else to go on here, and according to Metacritic, one outlet gave this a favorable review. And like I said, just looking at it, you can see that while it may be fine for a mobile game, it just isn't a worthy successor to the arcade original. And that's both games. Like I said at the top, I wanted to take this 10th annual WrestleMania special and do something a little different. Just put over one of my favorite arcade games of all time, even if it meant putting the boots to a game I haven't even played. But just the same, we're going to do like we always do and take a look and a listen side by side. To be perfectly honest with you fans out there, I think the music in the arcade game is the weakest aspect. Yoshihiro Kameoka did some great work on the NES, and even a decent job with that Game Boy Kunio game that became Double Dragon 2 in the US, but this is his only arcade credit, and it just feels like he wasn't familiar enough with the hardware to get the best tunes out of it. That being said, it's still better than the 2012 version. The music isn't bad, it's just kind of forgettable if you ask me. And hey, the graphics are definitely better in the arcade original. Lovingly rendered pixel art beats mobile cardboard cutouts for me every time. And that makes it time to give the edge. And you know something same name, different game stirs? It's pretty obvious, and you all knew it the whole time, just like I did as soon as I decided to make this episode. This is King Kong Bundy vs. SD Jones at WrestleMania 1. The 2012 version never had a chance. And when it comes to official channels, I'm afraid neither one of these games is currently available, but we can always hope. You know, if Bret Hart can come back to WWE, anything can happen. And maybe that means that Technos and Hamster and WWE will get together, hash this out, and re-release Superstars and WrestleFest. I would love that. Stranger things have happened, friends. But that's it for this year's WrestleMania special. Here's to the next 10. And remember, I'm Joey Pink, so the pleasure was all yours.
Promotional consideration paid for by the following. Step into the ring with the hottest WWF superstars like Hulk Hogan and Bret the Hitman Hart. Body slamming WrestleMania action is now on all video game systems. Marvel Comics' #1 tough guy, the Punisher, explodes onto Game Boy in the ultimate payback, non-stop shoot-'em-up arcade action, and a special appearance by Spider-Man from Acclaim. For body slamming WWF action in and out of the ring, it's WrestleMania Challenge for your NES, and it's WWF Superstars for Game Boy. Battle the Hulkster, Ultimate Warrior, and more from LJN.
Hey folks, it's Joe, and thanks for watching my Pro Wrestling Alter Ego rundown, one of our all-time favorite arcade games. If you dug the episode, do all the stuff, like, comment, hit the stupid bell, and tell me in the comments your favorite arcade wrestling game. If you really dug it, consider supporting the shows on Patreon. For just $1 a month, you get early access, your name here with all these cool people, and more. If you want more wrestling game videos, the entire WrestleMania special playlist is on the left. And if you want more Technos, the Double Dragon playlist is on the right.